Okay, I'm going to start passing out the quizzes. Please keep them face down till everybody has a copy. In fact, write your name as soon as you get the quiz on the back, and then turn it over and write your name on the front as well before you get started. So don't turn them over till everybody has a copy. That side. I'll take those. Go up to the front, there are more seats up there. So these 2 rows need them. All of them, I think. So, and you guys need this, right? Okay, if you don't have a quiz, just put your hand up. Okay, you can turn your quiz over, write your name on the front, and you have 30 minutes starting now. There are only 3 pages. Right, 10 minutes left. Time is almost up, so whatever last minute writing you got to do, get it done. Okay, time is up. Please hand your quizzes in towards the end of each row. Time is up. Any more quizzes out here? Time is up. Thank you. Time is up. Please bring your quizzes down if you haven't brought them down already. I think that's about it.
All right.
Okay. This is the guy who gave it in late. He took an extra 2 minutes. Okay, folks, get settled in, please. Okay. Everybody in? So here, so the usual rules apply. I'll let you know when the quizzes are done. You can come pick them up. Okay? Money, money, money. Okay. Let's talk about dividends. You're saying, what about the quiz? That was about as straightforward a quiz as I can write, right? I had to bend over backwards and think about how straightforward can I make it, because it's my way of saying I'm sorry for the second quiz. Okay, so these things average out. Okay, less moving parts. It actually wasn't. The second quiz was never as difficult as you thought it was. This quiz wasn't as easy as it looked like it was. Right? I mean, no, don't worry. There were no tricks there. I'm not taking that back. The only part I know that you had never seen was that exchange of debt for shares, right? And a few of you asked me at what price. What's the definition of an exchange? It happens. It's kind of, so The price is irrelevant because you took 30 million shares and gave me debt. And I considered writing that quiz in a way that would be trickier, and when I give you the solution, I'll tell you how I'd have written it. But for the moment, it was written in a way that you could pretty much go with the numbers you had. So today we're going to start with that aspect of dividends I talked about last session. I said one of the ways to look at dividends is to look at what a company could have paid out, potential dividends. So I'm going to use Greg as my... Don't worry, there's a lot of cash coming to you. I want it all back at the end though. So here's what we're going to do. Greg is the equity investor in a business. Okay? Potential dividend is the cash left over after you've met every conceivable need. Now if you think about equity investors, the income that equity investors get is net income, right? I know earnings are not cash flows. Let's say the net income for this company is $60. Okay? He's got my $60 now. So that's the accounting earnings. But then you remember accounting earnings are not cash flows, so if there's depreciation and non-cash charges, you should be adding them back. So here's another 20. So now he has $80 available to do whatever he wants, but then the checks come due. First, he's got to reinvest some money. So give me 20 of that back. So that goes into CapEx, so that leaves the company. Second, he notices that these are accrual earnings, and if there are things that you haven't been paid for, your working capital is, so let's say that's another 20. Okay? So a change in working capital comes out of this. Now let's assume there are no preferred dividends, because that'll be another drain if you have to pay that. Let's say there's $20 in debt coming due, so pay me the debt. But let's say that you decide to borrow money, because often when you pay off old debt, you replace it with new debt. So here's some good news. Let's say you borrow $20. So that's new debt coming in. What do you have in your hand? You're only 40? I thought you had 60. Okay, you're 40. I was just kidding. Okay, so you have $40 left over. That is cash left over after CapEx, after working capital, after debt payments. If he is the equity investor in the business, what can he do with that 40? He can put it in his pocket and spend it on falafels. I don't know, whatever you want. It is cash you can take out of the business. That is your potential dividend. You're saying, it's a small business. Let me take the 40 back before I forget. Okay. You're saying, what if it's a big company? What's different about a big company? Your equity investors in a big company, you start with net income, just like Greg did. You add back depreciation and non-cash charges because they're not expenses, so they're really cash available to you. Then you start writing checks out to preferred dividend, CapEx, working capital, all reducing your cash flows. If there's debt coming due, you pay off the debt. And if you borrow any money that's cash coming in, you add that back. What you're left with is called the free cash flow equity. Don't get thrown off. It's a word I concocted to kind of make it look sophisticated, but it's really potential dividends. Cash left over after every conceivable need. So let's take a look at that free cash flow equity. Let me ask you a couple of very generic questions, and I've asked you variants of this question before, so you might already have given me the answer. If you have a company with positive net income, can you end up with negative free cash flow equity? Now think about Greg. Could I have kept saying your CapEx is 60 and he gave me all the cash in his hand and said I have working capital need and said I have no more cash and then go dip into your pocket and give me more cash? Your free cash flow equity can be negative. And if your free cash flow equity is negative, how much can you afford to pay in dividends? Don't think too long. If you're already in the hole, you've got to stop digging. If you have negative free cash flow equity, you can't afford to pay dividends. If you have positive free cash flow equity, you can either pay it in dividends, you can buy back stock with it, or you can just hold the cash. Now if you think about all the line items that I have here, which financial statement are you most likely to be able to get all of these items? It's not going to be in the income statement. You could try to back it out of the balance sheet. It's going to be in your statement of cash flows. Every single item in this is in your cash flows. You can compute the potential dividend for your company by just focusing on that statement of cash flows and working through each line item to see what the potential dividend should have been last year. That's a lot of line items though, right? Because to get from net income to free cash flow equity, I need CapEx, I need depreciation, I need working capital, I need new debt, I need old debt being repaid. So I'm going to give you a shortcut, and I'm going to give you the conditions under which you can use that shortcut. Let's assume that you're a company with a stable debt ratio. Stable debt ratio in what sense? You've decided that 40% of your reinvestment, whether it's in CapEx or working capital, has to come from debt. Here's the shortcut that will give you the free cash flow equity with far fewer line items. You start with a net income still, but instead of going through the entire process, you subtract out just the portion of your reinvestment that comes from equity. Remember, as an equity investor, all you care about is you. You're saying, what cash do I have? What cash do I have to invest? So 40% comes from debt, 60% has to come from equity. So let's assume you start with $100 in net income. You have $60 in reinvestment, 40% of that comes from debt, $24 comes from debt, the remaining $36 has to come from you. You subtract that out, you end up with a free cash flow to equity. So this shortcut works only if you have a company with a stable debt ratio, but if it does, you could in a sense use the shortcut to come up with the free cash flow to equity. Otherwise, you've got to use the long calculation. So let's try this for Disney. Again, when you do free cash flow to equity, it's probably a good idea to do it over many years because you can have good years, bad years, things go up and down. So in this case, I started with a net income in each year, 2008 through 2012. I subtracted out net capex. This is something you probably haven't seen because I've always added depreciation and subtracted capex. I've just consolidated the two. In fact, I'm going to use this terminology from now on because it's going to get very useful in the context of valuation to actually set the two off against each other. Net capex is what you have to bring in as a company over and above your depreciation. What's net capex going to be? If capex is equal to depreciation, it's going to be 0, so you can ignore it. So if your capex exceeds depreciation, it's the extra money you got to come up with. That's my net capex line item. I subtracted change in working capital. Why? Because I'm converting accrual earnings into cash earnings. And then if I have debt issued minus debt repaid, I bring that in through that line item which says plus net debt issued. So if I have more debt issued than debt repaid, it's a cash inflow. If I have more debt repaid than debt issued, it's a cash outflow. I'm doing exactly what I did in the long calculation each year. So if you look at your free cash flow to equity across the entire 5-year period for Disney, they had about $27 billion in free cash flow to equity, if you include the cash flows coming in from debt, and $18 billion even if they had no debt. You heard of Warren Buffett has this concept called owner's earnings, which he's very fond of. Owner's earnings is actually net income minus net capex minus change in working capital. It's basically before the debt payment. And his argument is, if I'm an investor in a company, I don't want to be using debt as a source of cash flows. So owner's earnings in traditional value investing is a version of free cash flow to equity without the debt. So if you ask me what the owner's earnings for Disney is, it's $18 billion. But free cash flow to equity does include debt. It's $27 billion. Again, remind me what that tells me. That tells me how much Disney could have returned over these 5 years, $27 billion. But if you don't count the debt, they could have returned, what they actually returned, including buybacks, was about $20 billion. So across this 5-year period, if you look at only the cash flows from operations, you don't count the debt, they could have returned 18 and they returned 20. But if you also count in the cash flows from debt, they returned 20, but they could have returned 27. Nothing radical here, but at least you can start to get a sense of how could they afford to return 20 billion? It's because of the cash flows to return it. So this is actually a very easy number to compute for each of your companies. Go to the statement of cash flows, compute the free cash flow to equity. Then in that same statement of cash flows, you'd see dividends and buybacks. See what the company actually returned. Make a judgment on whether your company returned less than, more than, or just about what it could afford to return. Yes, Ali. Well, because if you're a growing company, debt is not, you're not borrowing money to make yourself more levered. So as a growing company, think of your debt ratio staying at 30%. You're growing 20% a year. Your debt should grow simply as your company grows. So it's not some abnormally high. So maybe I should separate out debt you're borrowing to keep up with your growth and debt you're borrowing just to recapitalize, just to separate like a permanent and a transient portion of debt. But to me, debt is not an unnatural way of paying cash flows. If you're a growing company, it's just one more way in which I'm expanding to cover my growth. So I don't have a problem with the more conservative approach, but I think that sometimes there can be a little give on it, especially, remember, some of your companies were under-levered, right? When you did your optimal debt ratio. Those companies should be able to pay more than the owner's earnings because they need to get to that 20 or 30% debt ratio. So I like to preserve that degree of freedom for myself, at least when looking at a company. Any other questions? So what I'm going to do is go back to 1996, Microsoft's glory days. So this was 10 years after their IPO. We don't realize how young Microsoft is as a publicly traded company because we think of it as having been around forever. It went public in 1986. So 10 years later, in 1996, I estimated the free cash flow to equity for Microsoft. And here's what the numbers look like. The net income was $2,176 million. The capex was $494 million. The depreciation was $480 million. Let me pause right there. Remember I said capex and depreciation need to be offset against each other? So the net capex here, 494 minus 480 is only 14 million. You say, how the hell did they grow so fast, investing so little in net capex? This doesn't look like you can grow, right? You're not so what's the answer to the question? Why does Microsoft look like it's reinvesting so little, at least based on the accounting definition of capex and depreciation? What are we missing when we look at that net capex? No, it's not. Nothing even as tricky as that. This is going to apply across all technology companies. Google's net capex is close to zero. Michelle? See, capitalizing, so the depreciation will get pushed up by that. So you're thinking about the... I think you're on the right track. But in fact, the biggest capex for Microsoft through much of its growth years was R&D, right? And through much of Microsoft's history, R&D has been expensed rather than capitalized. So your net income is already after your biggest capex. So with technology companies, don't be surprised to see tiny net capex simply because much of the capital expenditure is taken the form of expenses that are already in your income statement. So it's not that your cash flows are thrown off, it's just they're being moved around. So the net capex was 14 million. The change in non-cash working capital was tiny again. They don't have much inventory, no accounts receivable, only 35 million. So I computed the free cash flow at equity. Net income minus net capex minus change in non-cash working capital. They had no debt in 96, so I didn't have to worry about debt repaid and debt issued. Their free cash flow at equity was 2,127 million. So we said the free cash flow at equity is what you can afford to pay out, right? So I'll complete the story. In 1996, Microsoft paid no dividends and bought back no stock. So if you have 2,127 million in potential dividends and you pay no dividends and buy back no stock, I have a very simple procedural question. Where exactly would I see this 2,127 million in Microsoft's balance sheet? Somebody said retained earnings, wrong side of the balance sheet, right? Because retained earnings is net income minus dividend, so you might see it as retained earnings. It has to show up somewhere on the asset side, right? Can it be invested in projects? Or why cannot it be invested in projects? Because it's already after R&D and already after capex. So I've already counted it's not in working capital, in inventory, accounts receivable. What's the only place it has to go? Only place it has to go is cash. So that year, Microsoft's cash balance increased by 2.127 billion. Let me continue the story. 1997, Microsoft had free cash flow equity of about 3 billion. Return no cash, no dividends, no buybacks. So what happens in 97? You get another 3 billion on top of what you've already accumulated. You see what's going to happen? Each year you continue to do this, the cash balance is going to keep climbing because it's building on itself. And this doesn't even count the interest income you used to be able to make in cash in those days, 2, 3, 4%. In 1998, they had a $5 billion free cash flow equity. So why did it jump? Just look at your Windows upgrades. Great business to be in. Your cash is going low, you do an upgrade. Your free cash flows to jump that. It used to be at least. Now with the Office subscription model, it might have changed. But with the upgrade model, and in 1998, they paid no dividends, bought back. So Microsoft each year you can see is accumulating cash. And by the time you got to 2002, you can see that Microsoft's cash balance is going to be huge. It had cash balance at that time was considered huge of $30 billion or $35 billion. That, of course, we've changed. The scaling of that has increased. But when somebody asks, how did Apple end up with $220 billion in cash balance? This isn't manna from heaven that magically shows up on your balance sheet. It's a direct consequence of holding back cash you could have paid out to your investors. I'm not passing any judgment yet as to whether that cash balance is big, but I'm saying that's how you end up with big cash balances, is by holding back free cash flow equity you could have paid in dividends. So all you have to do when you look at your company, ask, is my company returning all it can in dividends? Is just look at their cash balance. If you have an $80 billion cash balance, the question's been answered. The question you now have to ask is, how did we end up with this much cash? Now, I'm actually going to try the same approach for a bank, and here it's a little messier. Why? Because the way I got free cash flow at equities, I took net income minus net capex minus change in working capital. And I think we've talked about this. Trying to do this for a bank is close to impossible. Net income is going to be easy, but net capex for a bank, I have no idea what even goes in there. And working capital for a bank, it could be everything, it could be nothing. Current assets minus current liabilities. So I'm going to draw on something I did when we did capital structure and redefined reinvestment at a bank as what you put into regulatory capital because you want to grow. So if you're a bank, that's what you have to set aside. So in this case, here's what I did. I took Deutsche, I took their net income, and I computed how much their capital would have to be increased, because in 2013, my judgment was that they would have to increase their capital over time to get to a desired capital ratio. So what you see here as my investment in regulatory capital in years 1, 2, 3, 4, basically are huge numbers because they're digging out of a hole. They're undercapitalized, they have to get to a higher capital ratio, they've got to invest a lot in capital. What does that mean? If I compute the free cash flow to equity, which is net income minus that investment in regulatory capital, the free cash flow to equity at Deutsche is negative. But then I look at what Deutsche is actually doing, and they're paying dividends. That is, it's not a puzzle, it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense, but you can see why it happens, right? We talked about sticky dividends. Why does Deutsche pay dividends even though they have negative free cash flow to equity? Because they've always paid dividends. It's as simple as that. And they're afraid to change. We talked about dysfunctional dividend policies. No company ever starts off saying, I want a dysfunctional dividend. Maybe a few do. But they start off with dividends that they can afford, and then the bottom falls out and they're afraid to change, and you're continuing to pay dividends that you no longer can afford. So if you're looking at a financial service company, which none of you should on your project, you could do a free cash flow to equity compared to the dividend, say, these are the banks that are paying dividends that they can afford to, these are the banks that are paying out more, and these are the banks that could pay more. So it's just a different way of thinking about what a bank could pay in potential dividends. So it's magical. It's an entire graph seemed to be disappearing, right? So take a look at your notes. Start of every year, I compute the dividends and the free cash flow to equity for pretty much every company on the face of the earth. Okay? And I classify them into groups. I'll have to borrow yours because I don't even remember what groups I classify them into. Actually, you read them to me. I can't even read my reading glasses. There are 5 groups I classify them. So everybody see the 5 groups in your notes? Okay? Depending on whether you have 4 slides to a page, 8 slides to a page, depending on how stingy you are with paper, you have all the slides, but you can't see what's on them. Okay? So what's the first group? To equity, no dividends, negative free cash flow to equity. Let's start with that group. So are these companies doing the sensible thing? Negative free cash flow to equity, no dividends, makes sense. What's the next group? Negative free cash flow to equity, positive dividends. This is like Deutsche, we have a problem. I'll complete the rest. You have positive free cash flow to equity, you pay our dividends, but the dividends are less than the free cash flow to equity. We have like Microsoft, accumulation of cash. You have positive free cash flow to equity, you have dividends that exceed the free cash flow to equity, you're burning through cash, and that might not be a bad thing if you are having just a bad year, or because you're under-levered and you want to push your debt ratio up. Or you can be one of those very strange companies where free cash flow to equity is roughly equal to the dividends. So what you're looking for is you're comparing free cash flow to equity and dividends, and what that graph shows you is among the 41,000 companies in the world, 25,000 probably have dysfunctional dividend policies. Either they're paying too much or too little in dividends relative to free cash flow to equity. Some of that can be explained by the fact that this is just 1 year, that if you expand it over 10 years, maybe things will look a little better. But I'm not that hopeful because, as I said, dividends are something that are very tough to explain based on fundamentals because companies just get into the habit of returning the same amount every year. So we've talked about how you build up cash, right? So every year you hold back cash you could have paid out. Your cash balance builds up. Sometimes companies build up cash and they face no blowback. Google, for instance, has an $80 billion cash balance. I haven't heard anybody say Google has too much cash. Facebook is starting to accumulate a $35 to $40 billion cash balance. Nobody seems to be complaining. Apple in 2011, in June, had acquired a $100 billion cash balance. Nobody blinked an eye. By September, somehow things had changed magically, and Apple had gone from being this company that nobody was questioning, and all of a sudden people are putting pressure on Apple to return cash. What I'm trying to say is sometimes companies accumulate cash and get away with it, and sometimes companies accumulate cash and you get a blowback. Let's think about why you get these different reactions. So I'm going to take you back to the early 90s, and I'm going to take a look at Chrysler. Old, boring company. In fact, it went through a near-death experience in the early 1980s when it almost went bankrupt, got bailed out. And in fact, it was still struggling in 85 when a guy called Lee Iacocca came in as CEO, and he turned the company around. By doing what? What did he introduce at Chrysler? It's made your trip to the grocery store a nightmare. It was a minivan. The Dodge Caravan was the very first minivan. So when you're cursing all those big minivans kind of getting in the way in every place you are, hey, it's Lee Iacocca's fault. But that's what essentially bailed Chrysler out. It made their revenues pick up, their income pick up. So what this is a graph of how Chrysler went from having almost no cash and being a close to broke company in 85 to where it was in 94. So each year, here's what I did. The white column is the net income each year. The black column is what they paid out as dividends and buybacks each year. So in 1985, they had about $1.5 billion in net income. They paid out about $200 million in dividends. So remind me again what happens. You have $1.5 billion in free cash flow equity. I'm sorry, $1.5 billion in free cash flow equity. I'm sorry if I said net income. $1.5 billion in free cash flow equity, $200 million in dividends. They're building up a cash balance of $1.3 billion. So I kept track of that. I did this for next year. Free cash flow equity, dividends took the difference, added on. What I'm trying to do is look to see how the cash balance is building up over time. And over the 10-year period, they built up a cash balance of about $8.5 billion. Doesn't sound like much, right, in today's $200 billion cash balance time. But that $8.5 billion was about 30% of Chrysler's value as a company in 1994. Chrysler in 94 was 30% cash business, 70% automobile business. So there's a big cash balance relative to its value. And unlike the Googles and the Facebooks of today, Chrysler came under pressure from an activist investor, a guy called Kirk Kerkorian. The guy is still alive, I think. He's like 120 years old. This was when he was a youthful 92 or 94 or something like that. Yeah. So the guy mounts a hostile acquisition bid. He actually in New York calls a press conference and he says, I'm going to try to take over Chrysler, and he's very specific. It's because I think they've built up too much cash and they should return cash to their investors. The only problem was he called the press conference before he'd arranged the financing for the deal, and the deal never went through, but there was a fight. I mean, basically this became a fight between Kirk Kerkorian saying you have too much cash and Chrysler saying, not really. And their first reasoning for why they needed so much cash was actually pretty intuitive. They said, we're a cyclical company. We're an automobile company. We can have good years and bad years. We're building up the cash just in case there's a recession. Makes sense, right? To which the question is, do you need $8.5 billion in cash? Is there a way you can look at this graph and tell me whether $8.5 billion is too much cash or too little cash for the next recession? Is there a recession during this 10-year period that you know of? This is 1989 through 91. That was actually a pretty severe recession in the US. And during the recession, did Chrysler burn through some cash? Yes, they did burn through some cash. They started about $3 billion and ended up with about $2.5 billion. So the last recession lasted 2 years and they burned through $500 million in cash. Let's do an algebra problem. If the last recession lasted 2 years and they burned through $500 million in cash, how long would the next recession have to last for you to need $8.5 billion in cash? I'll let you struggle with the algebra, but I think it's 34 years. So basically, you're running the company in case there's a 34-year recession. What are you going to do next? Next time it starts raining, why don't you go build an ark in the backyard saying, this is the big one, I've got to get ready. It's true you've got to build up cash balances to be prudent. But there's only so far. So if you built up a $2 billion cash balance, I'm willing to cut you some slack. $8.5 billion, that excuse doesn't fly. This is well beyond your need. The second reason scared the heck out of Chrysler stockholders. They said, no, it's not because we're cyclical. We need the cash just in case we decide to do a big acquisition. This makes you feel a lot better as Chrysler stockholders, right? Given the history of acquisitions, we know the one player who usually loses in an acquisition is stockholders in the acquiring company. And now you've told me that you're building up cash to do a big acquisition? That was a death knell for Chrysler's argument, because the minute they said that, investors said, no, give me the cash back. Kerkorian never took over Chrysler, but he won that war. Chrysler returned about $5 billion of its $8.4 billion in cash. It then got acquired by Daimler in one of the most unholy mergers of all time. A merger you could see it could not come to a good ending. It's like, I'm not even sure what the analogy would be. The brain just twists at the prospects. And of course, 15 years later, Daimler said this is not working. Chrysler got spun off to a private equity investor, and it's back to being a company on its own. So you can see how, and of course, Fiat then bought it. So basically, this started the process for Chrysler to go through a series of owners along the way. But what triggered it was this cash buildup. So what triggered the investor reaction here, though, was that Chrysler was building up cash in a business that was a bad business. That was the precipitating factor. Bad business in what sense? Remember, I said a good business, you have to earn more than your cost of capital. The automobile business, even in the 90s, had already crossed the threshold and become a bad business. And if you accumulate cash in a bad business, I, as an investor, I'm going to get really worried and say, give me the cash back. So here's where I'd like you to start with your company. Compute the free cash flow equity for your company. Go to the statement of cash flows, start with the net income, work down, compute the free cash flow equity. Not just for 1 year, try to do it for 3 or 5 years. The spreadsheet that's online for this actually does it for up to 10. You don't have to do 10, you can do up to 5 years. But basically, you're trying to compute what your company could have returned in cash each year, the free cash flow equity. And it can be negative, which actually makes your life very simple in dividend policy, because if you have negative free cash flow equity year after year after year, the company shouldn't be paying out any cash. Dividends or buybacks go off the table. If you have positive free cash flow equity, then at the same statement of cash flows, look to see what they paid in dividends and look to see what they bought back in stock. Both are cash flows, they should show up. See at least over the time period where your company falls in terms of whether it's paying out as much as it can, more than it can, or less than it can. Because if you can do that, you're set to kind of finish off this discussion of dividend policy. Because one of three things is going to be true when you make that comparison. Either your company is one of those very few companies that pays out exactly its free cash flow equity as dividends. And I'll give you an example. If any of you is doing Con Ed or a utility, you'll see that these companies are very good, at least across time, of returning their free cash flows equity as dividends. I think Con Ed, the number is 98%. For every $100 they generate in free cash flow equity, $98 gets returned to investors. But that's the exception. One or two things is going to be true when you do the comparison for your company. Either your company is going to be a company, just like in capital structure, a company that pays out too little in dividends, or it can be a company that pays out too much in dividends. Let's take the pleasanter problem first. If your company is paying out too little in dividends, almost by definition, I'm telling you it's building up a big cash balance, right? And here's the question you need to ask. Do I trust the managers of this company with my cash? And at this stage, you're not operating with a blank slate, I hope, because by this time, you've looked at their investment, you've computed their return on capital, their Jensen salary. You have a bunch of variables you've looked at to make a judgment about whether you trust this company or not. And if you trust the company, you're going to say, I'm okay. You have a big cash balance. I'm okay because you're not going to do anything stupid with the cash. Cash by itself never hurts investors. I know all the stories here about how cash is a terrible investment because it earns a low rate of return. You by now know how to dispense with those arguments, right? So when somebody says cash is a bad investment, it earns only a 1% rate of return, what should your response be? If you invest your cash in something riskless and liquid, what are you going to make? And if the answer is 1%, let's stop using that argument. Cash is not a bad investment. It's what investors do with the cash that scares you. And if you trust the managers, you're going to let them accumulate cash. If you don't trust the managers, of course you should demand the cash back, not because you're greedy, but because you're prudent. And that's when you start to see pushbacks against companies. And that's where corporate governance is going to get in the way, right? Because if you have voting and non-voting shares, even if you don't like the fact that cash is accumulated, there's not much you can do about it. Question?
So you said that, isn't there like a limitation at which point the cash being accumulated is not being used towards the...
Oh, we know that limit was passed at Apple when? Like 7 years ago. $200 billion. What are you going to do? Buy a country? I mean, let's face it, there is no investment that Apple can make in this lifetime or the next that's going to require $200 billion. So the question of, is this cash needed, was passed a long time ago. But that's not the question that worries me. If that cash is just sitting as cash, you know, all that happens, it goes through right into my stock price. So when I invest in Apple, I'm investing 2/3 of my money in this operating business with smartphones and computers, and 1/3 in a cash balance. And when I look at my overall portfolio, I'm going to say, look, I don't need a big cash balance. I already have Apple in my portfolio. And after yesterday, it's even more of the, soon the company will be 80% cash, 20% smartphone. I'll stop worrying about the iPhone already and think about this as a money market fund that pays me a nice big dividend. We're going to get there, right? So in a sense, there is a limit that got crossed in terms of operating needs. But I'm saying I'm okay with that as long as you don't do anything stupid with the cash. And that's where the trust comes in. And if that trust is shaken, then of course you're going to demand the cash back. Now, if your company is one of those companies that pays out too much in dividends, it's an oil company, it's a bank, and the question you've got to ask is, do I have good investments? Because if you have good investments, you're doing double damage to yourself by paying these big dividends, right? Because what's happening? You're taking all the cash you have, you're paying it out as dividends, you're rejecting projects you could have taken, and in a sense, you're damaging yourself first because you're paying out too much in dividends, and also damaging yourself further by not taking investments that could have increased your value. There's a final scenario, though, where you don't know where to start. You have a company that's paying out too much in dividends, and it has a history of taking bad investments. These companies are terrifying. Because if you ask them to cut dividends, you know what are you afraid of? They'll cut the dividends and take more bad projects. It's a scenario where you've got to say, your problem started with the investment problem. You've got to fix that. Just dividends are the symptom of the disease. They're not the disease. They're the easy problem to fix. But unless you fix the underlying investment problem, guess what? That dividend problem will keep coming back and coming back and coming back again. So think about both the quality of your investments and the cash flows coming in when you think about what your company should do in terms of dividend policy. So I like to think of this in terms of a matrix. On one axis, I put how much your company returns as cash relative to the free cash flow to equity. On the other axis, I put whether you have good projects or bad projects. You can use return on capital versus cost of capital to make that distinction. And I plot companies on this matrix because it tells me a little bit about what I think will happen to those companies. So let's start with the nice quadrant. These are companies that are building up cash, Google's, the Facebooks, but are perceived to have good investments. These are the companies that get the maximum flexibility in terms of dividends, because I'm going to let them run. Let's move across. You're a company that's building up cash, but you have a history, or you've just started to have a history of taking bad investments. These are the companies where you see the most pressure building up on the companies saying, give me the cash back. If you're a company with a cash deficit and you have good projects, you're paying out more in cash than you have available in free cash flow equity, and you have bad projects, you've got an investment problem. You've got to fix the investment problem if you really want to get out of this mess. And finally, if you have a company with, if you have good projects, then of course you've got to cut dividends and put them into the good projects. And if you have bad projects, you've got to deal with the investment problem. So when you have your 5 or 6 or 8 companies in your group in terms of dividends, free cash flow equity, and return on capital, just plot them in the matrix. It'll kind of do the analysis for you, because it'll tell you which of these companies you're going to leave alone, which of these companies you're going to put pressure on, which of these companies need to fix their investment problem, and which of them had to cut dividends and redirect back into investments. So let me return to Microsoft. I showed you Microsoft in 96 and 97 and 98. In fact, by 2002, their cash balance was $43 billion. At that time, the largest cash balance accumulated by a publicly traded company in history was $43 billion. It was Microsoft. I went through every equity research report I could find around that period, investor, none of them mentioned this as a problem. So somehow in 2002, even though it had a big cash balance, people were leaving Microsoft alone. Why? If you'd invested money in Microsoft in 1986, you invested in this tiny company. By 2002, it was the largest market cap company in the world. What did you have to complain about? This was a company that had delivered great returns on its projects and delivered great returns on your stock. You're saying, I trust them. However, things changed very quickly at Microsoft, as they seem to do at companies. In 2004, I mentioned this earlier, but right after that tax law change that reduced the tax rate on dividends, Microsoft paid the largest dividend in history. And they did it because pressure had somehow built up on them to return the cash. Now you can go back and look at between 2002 and 2004 what changed. One, of course, was the antitrust law. There was an effort by the Justice Department to sue Microsoft, saying you're using your control of Windows to control the apps. That was one. The other, I think, was more subtle. I talked about Microsoft's great projects, right? But I also said in the very start of this class that Microsoft has had only 2 great projects in its life: Windows and Office. Now, in the first few years, you said, that's 2 great projects in 6 years. That's okay. 2 great projects in 10 years, that's still okay. 2 great projects in 14 years, it's starting to get a little... There's somewhere between 2002 and 2004, people started thinking, hey, when is your next big hit coming? It's very subtle. I don't know when this happened, but there's a tipping point where your company goes from being fully trusted to investors don't trust. And I'll give Microsoft credit for one thing they've done very well. They've been very responsive to stockholders when they say, we don't trust you. Because you know what their response is? You don't trust us? Here's the cash. Whereas most companies, when you say you don't trust them, you know what they try to do? Oh, you should trust us. We've changed. We have good management. You cannot talk the management back into trust. You've got to act the management back into trust. And what that means is you've got to go out and take good projects and deliver good returns, and you will earn trust. Think of every good year as a year you're depositing money into a bank account. And every bad year is a year you're withdrawing money. You got to build up enough of a bank account to be able to live through those bad years. And life isn't fair. You can't complain about how unfair it is that investors have turned on you in spite of you doing good things for them. You got to take it for what it is. And if they don't trust you, give the cash back. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to play the role of a bunch of different CEOs, all of whom you're familiar with because they're all companies I've used all the way through. You're going to be stockholders in the company. And I'm going to act like you have the power to change dividend policy. So I'm going to start with Disney in 2002. I'm your CEO. Who am I? In 2002, who was Disney's CEO? Michael Eisner. So remember that. And personalities are going to matter because I've treated you like crap for the last 15 years when things were good. And you remember it, right? So in 2003, I come to you and I show you the numbers. Actually, I wouldn't. But let's say you've done the homework. You've seen the numbers. Between 1994 and 2003, I could have paid out $969 million in free cash flow equity every year. I actually paid out only $639 million. Let me pause right there. Each year I'm paying out $330 million less than I can for 10 years. 330 times 10 is $3.3 billion. You add interest, you're getting to 3.63. In fact, my cash balance was about $4 billion in 2003. And then here are the numbers I wouldn't tell you, but you've done your homework. It turns out that over those 10 years, I've generated a return in equity on my projects. It's about 2% less than my cost of equity. My stock has delivered about 3% less than what other stocks in the sector. The Jensen's Alpha is a minus 3%. And much of this underperformance I have had as a company is because of one big action that I took in 96 to buy Cap Cities ABC, that I as a CEO promised you would be the greatest acquisition ever. You ready? So I have $4 billion of your cash. You have my history. Given my history, would you trust me with your cash? It's not going to be unanimous, but you can already see that I'm going to have a really tough time convincing you to let me hold your cash. And given the fact that I'm Michael Eisner, and the fact that I haven't treated you well in the good years means that now when you want your cash back, you're not going to be polite about it. There's a reason why management should be good to their stockholders in the good times. There'll be time to say, hey, people are going to buy my stock no matter what I tell them. Because there will be bad times, and these stockholders are going to be in that room, and you've got to have built up some trust for them to be okay with you. So in 2003, there was immense pressure on Disney to give the cash back to stockholders. In fact, it went beyond that. If you remember that, Disney actually replaced its management, but you could see why the pressure was building up. And the trigger for this entire process, kind of unraveling on Disney, was that big acquisition of Cap Cities. So that's why when I see companies do big acquisitions, I caution managers, if you're making a pitch for this acquisition, this is not just about getting the deal done. You might get the deal through, but if this deal is a bad deal, you've ruined trust for a generation. People will not trust you for years to come because they'll remember how strongly you pitched this deal. It's like a gambler putting all of your bets on one number. If it pays off, great, but if it doesn't, you've lost flexibility on dividend policy probably for a generation. Let me move forward to 2009. Eisner's been fired, Iger's been hired, the anti-Eisner, right? Between 2004 and 2008, the CEOs changed, but not just that. My stock price improved dramatically. My Jensen's alpha went from negative to positive. My projects are now earning more than my cost of capital. So I've gone from bad projects to good projects. I'm actually returning more cash than I have available. So my dividends are now higher than my free cash to equity. I've gone from a company accumulating cash to a company returning cash. Why? Because in fact, it's almost like they did everything Eisner was doing and did the exact opposite. But it's now 5 years later, and I come to you with a plea. I say, look, I've been giving you more cash than I have available, but I'd like to take some of this cash back and put it back into the company because I see all these great prospects, and I give you these projects I'm planning to do. Shanghai, Disney, a new movie business I'm going to get into. And I ask you again for permission to kind of start holding cash. Again, it's not going to be unanimous, but you can see that I'm now operating from a position of strength because I'm using my track record to justify what I'm going to do. So in 2009, that's what Disney did, was able to sell stockholders the notion that they could return less cash. Let's move forward to 2013. Now you're back to building up cash again. You bought, with some of that cash, you bought Lucasfilms, you bought Marvel, you've done some good things, and you've told me that, you took, and in a sense, you've delivered on this. So your return on capital is still higher than your cost of capital. Now I have a cash balance, and someone in the audience says, why don't you guys start to pay more dividends? And I said, no, you got to trust me with the cash. I'm still okay, right? 2013, I'm still okay because my investments have been in Marvel and Lucasfilms, which have been good investments, and I can point to those. This is a story that doesn't ever end, right? 2016, I want you to think about where we are now. Well, Bob Iger has nobody under him, no top management under him. And if Disney is one misstep away from going back to 2003, right? One of the reasons they're so worried about ESPN is the cash cow that has allowed them to pay the dividends and do the buybacks that they did. So if that becomes shaky and Shanghai Disney starts off badly, they're in trouble. Right now they're dancing on the desk with Jungle Book doing much better than they expected. But movies are never going to be the tipping point for this company. It's too big a company. So again, you get a temporary reprieve from stockholders when you do well. And Disney for the moment has that freedom. Let me do one final company and then we'll end for the day. I'm going to take Vale, and you're going to see a problem right when I present you with the numbers. And this was in 2013 when they were a healthier company than they are today. Their free cash flow equity was about 19 billion. That's pretty good, right? 19 billion. So if you have 19 billion in free cash flow equity, you should pay out about 19 billion in dividends. They actually paid out about 43 billion. They're paying out way more than they can afford. So the solution seems simple, right? I'm going to be Vale's CEO. I was going to make it Vale's CFO, but he actually was a student of mine. I want to pick on him. He went through this class 20 years ago, actually. Okay? So Vale's CEO. I'm going to get up, and you're my stockholders, and I'm going to make a plea. And what's my plea? You see, this is insane. We can't keep doing this. I'd like to cut dividends. Sounds reasonable, right? You're corporate finance people. You're saying that's, cut dividends. But before you do that, remember why Vale pays the dividends that it does. It has two classes of shares. Common shares and preferred shares. really voting shares and non-voting shares. You guys have the non-voting shares, and in return for not giving you voting rights, I gave you this big dividend. Part of the reason they have a dividend problem is because they created these. So if you were to acquiesce to my cutting dividends, what would you want in return? You'd want voting rights, and you'd be entitled to demand it. And guess what I'm going to do? And this is, I think, the problem with control, is I will not give you the voting rights and continue to pay the dividends that I did. I'd rather control a company that is bankrupt than give up control and have a company that's healthy. That's how much control kind of dominates the thinking in family-controlled companies and government-controlled companies. It is insane for Vale to do what they do. And it's not just Vale. You took a look at Vale, you look at Petrobras. These are companies that should have cut dividends 3 years ago. But they continue to pay dividends because they're trapped in a vice between giving up control and maintaining a dividend policy that they can't keep going. So we'll end with that. Next session we will start with a couple of other companies and finish up dividend policy. But if you build up the entire analysis on that point,
I used totally because I said my investment was not,
and stay the point.
but then the rest of my team is using.
They shouldn't be constrained in this point too, right? You don't all have to build off the same thing. But to the degree that they have on the side.
Quick question. So, what if always return free cash flow?
All of it,
then
100%?
those investors, if you believe in management, buy more shares. If you don't, buy shares in a different
In
stock.
other words, change the dividend policy
Because it
itself.
seems like you're voting for everybody.
Yeah, but remember, buying back stock is not going to be enough, right? If you return all of the free cash flow equity and I have investments to make, I need the cash in the company to make those investments. So one reason I hold back free cash flow equity is this is a single year's free cash flow equity. And if my projects are lumpy, I get one good big project every 3 or 4 years, I will need the cash next year. And if I return all the cash this year, I'm going to have a deficit next year, right?
But I thought it was after CapEx.
But what if your CapEx is bigger than your net income? What if that, the essence of lumpy CapEx is it can be big enough
You
to
gotta
be,
save up so you can make a big
if you
CapEx
have
later.
enough net income to cover even your biggest CapEx years, you can go to a residual dividend policy, which means you just return what you have left. If there's nothing left, you get nothing. If you get a lot left, you get a lot. Okay? And it's got nothing to do with you buying back stock. You're essentially saying equity is a residual claim. This is the cash flow left over. You guys are entitled.
Right.
If you bring in these cycles, and even the biggest companies have cycles, then you might want to at least hold back enough cash to cover the cycles. It's not going to be that much, to be quite honest. It's definitely not going to justify holding a $40 billion cash balance, but it might be enough to justify 1 or 2. So you might build a buffer and say, I would, but that's, I think, the question is, why do we have a dividend policy which is fixed? That's the part that doesn't make sense, right? Why do you keep paying a fixed amount of cash when, in fact, equity is a residual claim? And your point is, why not just go to a residual cash flow then? Right? And that's what buybacks start to do, right? Because in a sense, you're saying, I'm not going to pay dividends, I'm just going to buy back stock. And in a sense, what you're doing there is you're buying back stock in the good years, you're not buying back stock in the bad years. So it steps you away from that